Uh, the name of the parsha, Vayera, means and he appeared, and it is found in Genesis chapter 18. Okay, so the story begins, the nutshell begins. God reveals himself to Abraham 3 days after the first Jew's circumcision at age 99. But Abraham rushes off to prepare a meal for 3 guests who appear in the desert heat. One of the 3, who are angels disguised as men, announces that in exactly 1 year, the barren Sarah will give birth to a son. Sarah laughs. That's the introductory, the opening scene of the parsha. Abraham is sitting at the tent, the opening of his tent at the heat of the day, middle of the day, and 3 people appear, and he feeds them, and he takes care of them, and he prepares meat and bread, etc. Okay, so that's the first scene. The next scene is Abraham pleads with God to spare the wicked city of Sedom, because, as we'll see, God tells Abraham that is of his intention to destroy the city of Sedom, and it's really 5 cities, but the most prominent city was called Sedom. Okay, so Abraham pleads with God to spare the wicked city of Sedom. 2 of the 3 disguised angels arrive in the doomed city, where Abraham's nephew Lot extends his hospitality to them and protects them from the evil intentions of the Sodomite mob. The 2 guests reveal that they have come to overturn the place and to save Lot and his family. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt when she disobeys the command not to look back at the burning city as they flee. So Lot is told that, basically it's just 2 of his daughters, his wife and 2 daughters. The other 2 daughters wanted to stay behind. Lot tells them, the angels tell them to run to the mountains and not turn back. His wife turns back and she turns into a pillar of salt. Why that's significant, maybe we'll get to that. Okay, while taking shelter in a cave, Lot's 2 daughters, believing that they and their father are the only ones left alive in the world, get their father drunk, lie with him, and become pregnant. The 2 sons born from this incident father the nations of Ammon and Moab. Very strange story. And that's the origin story of 2 of the nations that are our cousins, because Lot is Abraham's nephew, so it was Isaac's first cousin, and they actually lived in the lands east of the Jordan River. And in fact, when the Jewish people were coming to conquer the land of Israel and also lands east of the Jordan River, God says, don't attack or don't provoke war against these 2 nations of Ammon and Moab, because they too are the descendants of Abraham, and they inherited that land east of the Jordan by right. But there's a lot to talk about the city of Sedom and the incident of the 2 daughters, a lot of mysticism, a lot of symbolism. We'll see how much we can get to that. Okay, Abraham moves to Gerar, where the Philistine king Abimelech takes Sarah, who is presented as Abraham's sister, to his palace. In a dream, God warns Abimelech that he will die unless he returns the woman to her husband. Abraham explains that he feared he would be killed over the beautiful Sarah, and that's why he said she's his sister. We had that similar story last week when they went to Egypt. So now it's when he went to Gerar, which is a Philistine land on the coast, probably very close to the Gaza Strip or in the Gaza Strip. So that's in the news, and that lines up now as well. Okay, now we come to the more difficult parts of the parsha. That's some of the tests. First, some joy. God remembers his promise to Sarah and gives her and Abraham his son, who was named Isaac. Yitzchak means will laugh. Isaac is circumcised at the age of 8 days. Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah 90 at their child's birth. Hagar and Yishmael. So who's Hagar and Yishmael? We read about this last week. Sarah did not have children. She told her husband to marry her maidservant Hagar. She then gave birth to Yishmael. And there was an incident last week where Hagar ran away because Sarah was pressing her because Hagar was disrespecting Sarah. Then they come back. The angel tells them to come back. Now they're back. But now when Isaac is born, the verse says that Sarah sees that Ishmael is mocking Isaac, whatever that means. And Sarah wants Abraham to banish the maidservant and her son. Abraham does not want to, but God tells him to listen to Sarah, that's another whole story. We can get into that as well. So Hagar and Ishmael are banished from Abraham's house and wander in the desert. God hears the cry of the dying lad. They ran out of water. So he's in threat of life-threatening situation. But God hears the cry of the dying lad and saves his life by showing his mother a well. Avimelech makes a treaty with Abraham at Be'er Sheva, where Abraham gives his 7 sheep as a sign of their truce. And he names that city, he names that region Be'er Sheva. Literally, Sheva is a tricky word in Hebrew because it means 7, and it also means oath. Here, both of those events happen, right? He gives him 7 sheep, so it's Sheva as in 7, but it's also oath of the sign of the truce. And that's really the reason why the city is called Be'er Sheva, which is the biggest city in the south of Israel today, and the capital of the south of Israel, people call it. And the Torah says because it's called Sheva Kisham Nishbu Shneim, there both of them took an oath. Okay. Finally, we come to the final portion in the Torah. This is the climax of the tests. We know the sages say that God tested Abraham 10 times. This is the final test. It's the only time explicitly in the Torah uses the term test, which begs the question of why God needs to test Abraham so many times. That's another question we can get into. But in any case, this is the binding of Isaac. God tests Abraham's devotion by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Isaac is bound and placed on the altar, and Abraham raises a knife to slaughter his son. A voice from heaven calls to stop him. A ram caught in the undergrowth by its horns is offered in Isaac's place. So that's the story in a nutshell. There's a lot of details in the parsha, a lot of drama, some interesting scenes, a lot to talk about. But that's, I guess we have to start somewhere. So that's the beginning. If anybody has any comments or questions, or you want to discuss some specific story, I would love to hear, because that would be interesting. Otherwise, we'll start and we'll see how far we get. Go ahead, Dr. Ken, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a question about distances. I mean, from southern Gaza or from Gaza to get up to Jerusalem, to bring your child up there, to sacrifice him. What is the significance of all of the geographic distances that take place?
So I'm sure there's mystical significance as well, and there is. But let's just talk practically. Practically speaking, the geographical information in the Torah, as well as other information, like you talk about names of people and who his wife was and who his cousin was and who his concubine was, Esav's concubine, like who really cares? Okay. But part of what this does is it grounds the story, and you see that it is a historic event. There is a story there is a book in the Bible, the book of Job. And the book of Job is a very interesting book, probably one of the most famous books in the Bible. Not that people read it, but people hear about the book of Job, because Job is the one who suffers tremendously, and he questions God's judgment. He questions God's judgment, but he still maintains his faith. But in any case, the book of Job begins, and it's so different than the rest of the Bible, though. So that's telling of the rest of the Bible. The book of Job begins. Oh, that's even before we go there. Who was Job? Where did he live? Who was he? So the Talmud actually has 10 opinions about who Job was. Some people say it was Moses. Some people say it was Abraham. Some people say it was Adam. There's one opinion in the Talmud that Job, the story never happened. It's all a metaphor. Now, why are there so many opinions about who this Job is? Because essentially the way the book starts is once upon a time. Ish haya be'eretz Utz. There was a man in the country of Utz. His name was Job. Very different than the Bible. No one ever heard of the country of Utz. No one ever heard of Job. No one doesn't say who his father was. It doesn't say who his mother was. It doesn't say where he came from. It doesn't say where he's going. Right? So then you could say, oh, this is I'm not going to say a fairy tale, but this could be a metaphor. This doesn't have to be a story that is grounded in reality. Right? And that's that style of that book. And therefore, some people say it was some of these people. Some people say it was one of these 10. Some people say it never existed. Maybe it was multiple people. Maybe all the great believers struggled with God as Job did. But Job, you could say it's a metaphor. But when you have a story, and you know Abraham, where he came from born in Ur-Kasdim, born in Iraq, migrated to Haran in Turkey, came down to Israel, and from the Israel he started at the south, and then traveled north. Traveled in the north, and then traveled south until he came to Israel, until he came to Jerusalem, and then he further traveled south, Beersheba and Hebron, and then the binding of Isaac. You say it's not so easy to get from Beersheba to Jerusalem. Well, the binding of Isaac was 3 days later. They didn't get there overnight. He wasn't even sure where to go, but that's another story. So the point here is, on a very basic level, there is the fact that the story is full of locations and names and times and spaces, and we know who existed, and we know who was married to who, and we know who couldn't get along with who, right? That's part of the story, and that's part of the style, that it's telling you this is not a metaphor. There was a person, this is our ancestor, this is Abraham, he took possession of the land, that's why we have the land, etc. So that's on a very basic level. Mystically speaking, there are all kinds of different interpretations about where Abraham is traveling. We did a little bit about this last week. He came to different cities, and Rashi is saying, well, he came here because in the future, there was this event that happened here. In other words, certain cities have certain energies, and those energies would bring out certain feelings within people, or certain stories. So, for example, last week we mentioned the city of Shechem, and the city of Shechem is almost always a city where there's tension and difficulty. Joseph was sold in Shechem. Shechem was when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. That's where they're supposed to have this, right outside of Shechem, there's two great mountains, Gerizim and Ebal, and they're supposed to have a ceremony which represents the two mountains, represents the blessing and the curse, and it represents the idea that we have free choice of who to choose. So there's a lot of tension in Shechem. Jerusalem is supposed to be the city of serenity, the city of peace. And so there are moving from place to place also represents tapping into those energies. But that's more of a mystical answer. And a practical answer, everything has it grounds the story. And also the geography also tells you certain things about the story. So for example, we're going to talk about Sedom. And Sedom today, it's in the desert next to the Dead Sea. But at that point, the Torah says it was a very fertile land, and it was like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt, was the quote from last week's parsha. Now, why was it so fertile? Well, why was Egypt so fertile? Because it had the river Nile, the Nile River, and around the Nile River, the land is very fertile. They call it the Nile Delta. So in Israel, Sedom, being next to the Jordan River, was also had a tremendous amount of water, and that's why that land was fertile. So where Abraham is, there's less water. You need the rain. So there's more of a dependence on God. So even that topography does affect the culture. And you see that clearly with Sedom, and the Torah almost makes that point explicitly by saying that Sedom is like Egypt. And when you say it's fertile like Egypt, in the Torah, you don't want to be like Egypt, because Egypt represents the corruption, moral corruption, and taking advantage of other people, etc. This whole slavery was developed in Egypt because they needed manpower for agriculture. The bottom line here is, when the Torah tells you that something is like Egypt, it's not just an innocent marker, but it's also telling you that in the Torah's view, this culture is problematic. But in a large degree, the culture is today maybe less, but in the ancient world, the culture is formed and shaped by the land, by the topography, by the weather, by the climate, by the rain. All these things affect how the culture of the people and the place.
Thanks, Rob.
That is a little bit about places in the book of Genesis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so there's different ways to read the story, to read the parsha, and we'll start with I'll start with a little introduction, and then we'll try to see the bigger themes. The first thing I want to mention is that it's not the most natural place to break the parsha. We have generally two portions about Abraham, last week and this week. And last week, the portion ends with the circumcision. And this week picks up right after the circumcision, because it says that Abraham was sitting. I'll share the screen. Abraham is sitting at the tent in the heat of the day, and God appears to Abraham. Why does God appear to Abraham? So it's a very unusual statement in the Torah, and I'll tell you why. Let me just find it. Whoops. Okay, so here we have the text of the Torah, Genesis chapter 18. And the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. And he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, three men. Okay, this is a very, very strange statement in the Torah, that God appears to somebody. Why is it so strange? Not because God doesn't appear to other people in Torah, he does. But always when God appears to somebody, there's a communication. There is a purpose. It's not just here, what's the purpose? It doesn't say anything. God appears to Abraham when he's sitting at the tent. And then what happened? Nothing. Right? And so that's very strange. And God shows up. What does he show up? He wants coffee. What does he want to do? So therefore, that leads the commentaries to explain. And I'll show Rashi. Rashi says, and the Lord appeared to him to visit the sick. Said Rabbi Chama, the son of Chanina, it was the third day from his circumcision. And the Holy One, blessed be he, came and inquired about his welfare in the Talmud Baba Metzia. In other words, we have a problem. The Torah says that God appeared. The Torah doesn't say why he appeared or what he did when he appeared. So therefore, that leads the rabbis to explain this event is right after the previous event. It's right after the circumcision. It's the aftermath of the circumcision. Abraham is ill. Abraham is not feeling well. God comes to visit him. That's the Medrash. If that's the case, then why stop the portion right before and after the circumcision? Like why stop that story right there? You would think it's still part of the circumcision story. Stop it after the circumcision story or before the circumcision story. Talk about where to break the story is an important discussion. Last week, as I mentioned last week we discussed about where you're starting the story. This week, it's interesting to think about where to break the story. And the commentaries explain that if you look at Abraham, you will see that there's a change in Abraham, a significant change. Torah doesn't make a big deal about it, but if you think about it, it's a very deep change before and after the circumcision. And before the circumcision, when God would appear to Abraham, it says Abraham would fall on his face. In other words, the experience of the revelation from above, the experience of the awareness of God was overwhelming. You couldn't just, it would take you over. You would literally collapse. You see this later in the prophets also. That's when prophets would experience prophecy, sometimes they would roll on the floor. Sometimes they would just go crazy. In fact, the title for a prophet in the Bible, in some cases, is the Meshuggah, the crazy one, because sometimes prophets said crazy things like, "Your kingdom, which you think is so strong, is gonna be destroyed." But sometimes they would also acted crazy in the moment of prophecy. So that's what I said before. Abraham would fall on his face. All of a sudden, the opening statement of this week's parsha is God appeared to him, and what happened to him? He doesn't fall on his face. He doesn't go crazy. And he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. So it's midday. It wasn't a revelation in a dream. Often God will come to people in a dream. It wasn't in a dream. It was in the midday, and it was hot. And what happened when God came to him? He actually did not lose his senses. He was actually able to see that there were three people that were passing and are hungry. And he ran, and he prostrated themselves to the ground. And then he invited them. He said, Please let a little water be taken and bathe your feet and recline under the tree, and I will take a morsel of bread and sustain your hearts. Afterward, you shall pass on. In other words, while he's sitting in the middle of the day, while he is interacting with people, he still senses the presence of God, and the presence of God doesn't overwhelm him, doesn't make him fall on the floor. Now that is a big change. What is the cause of that change? So the symbolic cause is the change is a circumcision. Because what is circumcision? There are many mitzvot in the Torah, there are many commandments, But in some sense, the most important commandment is symbolized, and that's why this was the first commandment that Abraham was commanded, because the circumcision represents the purpose of all the commandments. And the circumcision represents that the relationship with God does not remain in the abstract, does not remain in meditation, but it actually changes the physical body. Now, it's true about all the mitzvot, but you don't see it in all the mitzvot. Circumcision, you can actually see. And the point is, when a person does a mitzvah, a person does a good deed, it's actually going to change the person, and the person becomes more open to spirituality. And every mitzvah is a refinement, and every mitzvah is a way to align not just the soul, but also the body, also the physical parts of the person with God. And that's why the big news here, the big news is that after the circumcision, it's a changed Abraham. And that's why if you have to break the story, you're going to break the story. Where are you going to break the story? You're going to break the story up to the circumcision and right after the circumcision, because that's the big change. What's the big change? It used to be that to experience holiness, you had to fall on the floor, which means you had to forget about experiencing the world with your senses. Maybe you can experience God in a dream, when you go into a trance, when you go into the subconscious space. But when you're living your life and interacting with people, and it's the middle of the day and you're sitting in traffic, there you can have the awareness of God. That's the old model. That's the model of pre-circumcision. But then the model of after the circumcision, like I said, it's really the model of every mitzvah. It's not just circumcision, it's every mitzvah. But circumcision is one which symbolizes this transition, that the power of a relationship with God is one that can actually refine the physical person. So now, you could be interacting with other people and you could sense the presence of God. So that's one point about where you divide. I said it last night, so I'll say it again because it was by divine providence. I said last night that I don't recommend this, but I was listening a few minutes listening to traffic, so I turned on the BBC on NPR. I'm not saying you should do it, especially not now. I don't know if that should be your preferred way of hearing the news, but in any case, they were talking about the cinemas, and they were talking about. I don't follow this, but they were saying that lately there have been some very long films, maybe 3 hours or more, and then some are actually putting in an intermission in middle of the film, and they were saying that was the old model. That's the way it was when you had silent films. And then they say it's a very important question of where are you going to put the intermission, because you don't want to break the tension, right? You don't want to build up tension and then break it and then have to go back to it. So it's a whole art of where are you stopping the film to put in the intermission. So last night I was saying that's exactly the struggle over here. Why did the Torah stop the portion of Abraham specifically at this time? And now you see that there's a reason, and because it's a significant change. It doesn't look like a big change, but if you think about it, that's the big transition between before circumcision and after circumcision. Whether my relationship with God is only for times when I'm removed and separate and apart in a state of meditation, in a state of a trance, a state where I'm separate from the rest of the world, almost like a Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur, you're not going to eat, I'm not going to drink, I'm not going to read the news, I'm just going to stay in the synagogue and I'm going to feel spiritual. That's wonderful. You need some of that. But that's not the day-to-day model. That's not the model of Judaism. That's a model of once a year to be able to recharge. But Judaism is, could you experience holiness in your day-to-day life and your day-to-day interactions? Okay, that's introduction number one. Then we have to get to introduction number two, and then we can start actually getting into the parsha. Introduction number two. There's a very fascinating teaching of the sages. The sages read the story, and what's the takeaway? Beautiful, beautiful takeaway. It's very profound. Going back to the story. The Lord appeared to Abraham. Got to get this out of the way so I can see what's going on over here. Okay, the Lord appeared to Abraham, to him, in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot, and he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men were standing beside him. Imagine God came to you, and you're having a conversation with God, and there's a knock on the door, and you see 3 people, you're sitting at the door, and you see 3 people passing by. What do? Or forget about God. Imagine the president of the United States comes to visit your house, and then you see 3 people passing, or your boss, or anyone else is important to you. And then you see 3 people passing by. So now there's a tension. Who do I do? Who do I talk to? Do I talk to God, or do I talk to the 3 people who may need some help? So that's the tension. That is the tension in the story. And what does God do? Vayomar, and he said, Abraham says, my Lord means Mr., but it's not clear what this word means. He's either talking to God or he's talking to the leader of the 3 people. But in any case, he says, if I only find favor in your eyes, please do not pass on from beside your servant. He's either telling the guests not to pass by his tent, but to enter, or he's telling God, Adonai, my Lord, God, don't pass, even though I'm going to take care of the guests. Stay here, wait for me. And then he continues, and it's clear what he does. So the tension is, so he knows, we know what he does. What he does is he goes, leaves God alone, and he goes and greets the three guests, which is strange. You wouldn't expect that from somebody like Abraham. God came to visit you. It's sacrilegious to say, God, hold on a second, I have a meeting. I'm talking to somebody else, right? It's a very strange thing. So the sages say something very powerful. The sages say, this teaches that inviting guests, greeting guests, is greater than greeting the divine presence. Greater than greeting God is inviting guests. Okay, that's very powerful things, because usually a spiritual seeker is more interested in the spiritual world than in the practical world. And here the commentaries say, what Abraham teaches us, if you have a choice to have a spiritual experience, which is enlightenment, which is connecting to God, experiencing the revelation of God, but then you have guests that maybe they're thirsty, maybe they're hungry, maybe they have to eat. Better to leave God and greet the guests. That's one interpretation of the sages is saying. If you want to get a little bit deeper, the sages say in Hebrew, if you want to take the Hebrew literally, it's not one is greater than another. In Hebrew, then another is from another. Gedolah hachnasat orchim. Inviting guests is great, from greeting the divine presence. So in English, I translate it. What it means is it's greater to greet people, greater to greet guests than to greet God. But you can really read it and say, no, what it's really saying, the literal translation here is great is the inviting guests from greeting God. In other words, it wasn't a contradiction. To Abraham, I set it up as tension. Who do I go? God is in my living room. And then the guest at the door. Who do I go to? No. For Abraham senses that the way to experience God is to care about other people. So when I say from, it's greater to go and greet guests coming from the experience of experiencing the revelation. Because when you experience divine revelation, the result of that is, what do you want to do? Oh, I want to be God, like God. I want to go and greet people and interact with people. What does that come down to? It comes down to what we said in the beginning of the book, in the first portion, that every person was created in the image of God. So if every person is created in the image of God, when I greet somebody in the street, that is, in a sense, greeting God. Because every person has a soul. Every person is created in the image of God. So that dichotomy of there's a spiritual and then there's the way I act in everyday life to other people, that is very pagan, because God is a force of nature or whatever it is. And then there are people, and there's tension between the two. And then you have to decide, do I want spiritual experience or do I want to interact with people? Do I want spiritual or do I want physical? And we see here after the circumcision, when we said the circumcision represents that the holiness penetrates the physical body. In Abraham's consciousness, he understands that you could find God not only in a spiritual experience, but in a physical experience. So then the result is I find God not only when I'm secluded and have a revelation or study Torah or pray or fast on Yom Kippur, but if I interact with another person, I see the Spirit of God in another person and I take care of another person. And that is Abraham coming, the revelation leads him to greet the guests. So that is a very powerful thing, and it's very different than what you would think about the first spiritual seeker, who is somebody who experiences revelation and he has an intense spiritual revelation. But what does that get him to do? Okay, now I have to greet other people. So that's something to ponder. That's introduction number 2. Thank God we have 13 minutes left to do the rest of the parsha. I'm only kidding. I have to come back next year to get more of the rest of the parsha. Go ahead, Bonnie, please.
Thanks, Rabbi. You said that the 3 people that came to Abraham in the desert were actually angels.
Yeah. So let's talk about that yeah, go ahead.
How is that significant as far as like trying to decide if you're going to talk to God or talk to angels?
So it's very interesting. 3 people come to Abraham, and Abraham feeds them. And he doesn't think they're angels, because if they're angels, you don't have to slaughter a cow and you don't have to prepare the meats, right? So he doesn't know they're angels. We'll talk about what angels means. That's another whole story. We'll get to that later. But In this entire story, it calls them anashim, men. Doesn't refer to them as angels. Three men came. The only reason why you would think they're angels is because at the end of the story, after they're well fed, they tell Abraham, "Where's your wife Sarah?" So he says, "There, she's in the tent." So one of them say, "I will return in 1 year, and your wife will have a son." Sarah hears and Sarah laughs. Then God says, "Why is she laughing?" God can do anything. So that's a strange scene. All of a sudden, if you're an Arab, now it's possible that just a person comes in and sees that Abraham has no sons, or Sarah has no sons. There was Ishmael, but Sarah has no sons. So he says, "I'm giving you a blessing. Next year, you'll have a son." It's possible to read it as men. It's possible. But I'm just giving you all the information. Then the next story, which we're going to talk about, hopefully if you have a few minutes, is two of the men go to Sedom, and they're heavily involved in saving Lot from the city of Sodom, extracting him. And they tell Lot, "You have to leave because we are destroying the city." And of course, God destroys the city. The city is destroyed by Hashem, but the angels say, these people say, we are destroying the city. Also, the angels, when they come there, they appear as regular people, but they're referred to as angels. So this, if you want to read the story and you read the whole story, is at first, both Abraham and Lot, by the way, Lot, Abraham's son-in-law, is part of the story. Lot is under great risk. He invites those people into his house. He doesn't know they're angels. So that the short answer is that it doesn't affect Abraham's decision to leave God and invite the people. Was not colored by the fact that he thought they were distinguished people. In fact, he thought they were regular Arabs that Rashi says he says, "Wash your feet before you come into the tent." And apparently that was unusual. So he says sometimes the Arabs in that culture, when we say Arabs, I mean they're from Arabia, they would bow to the dust of their feet. So in their mind, these people are complete pagans. They have no enlightenment. They're not enlightened at all. And yet he's inviting them. Okay. Now, I just want to say that when you say angel is a very tricky word in Hebrew, because the word malach, like I said, in this parish, in the first story, it doesn't say the word malach. It doesn't say angel. It says people. And then in the second story, it starts referring to them as malachim, angels. The problem with the word angel is that in Hebrew, the word angel and the word messenger is the same thing. Malach is a messenger. So when I say that they're angels, let's say God sends two people to take Lot out of Sedom. Does it mean that they're a mystical angel that just appear like a human being and this is sort of very mystical and very miraculous? It could be it's a regular person, but he's referred to an angel because an angel could be a messenger of Hashem. You see what I'm saying? So it's very hard to know. You can read this any way you want, is what I'm trying to say. You can read it as very supernatural, but you can also read this as very natural. And yes, God sends, for whatever reason, God sends people and they say, "We know there's trouble in the city, get out of here." You can read it on a very natural way, or you could read it on a sort of mystical way or supernatural way. But either way, the first half of the story, it does not say the word, it doesn't say the word malachim, which is messengers. It just says anashim, they're people. So he had no indication that anything is unusual until they said, I'm coming back in a year and your wife is going to have a daughter, and by the way, a son. And by the way, there's this whole story where Sarah laughs. And why did Sarah laugh? Did she have no faith? One interpretation is, why wouldn't she laugh? She had no indication that this guy is an angel, a messenger from God, right? Now to think, especially if you think about this, just an Arab, just a regular person. Maybe it was a regular person. And the person was so moved by their hospitality, so they gave her a blessing. So she laughed. So God says, don't laugh, but God can do it, right? So when you say that they're angels and messengers, that itself could mean you can read the story any way that makes you comfortable, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so that is introduction number 2. Now I want to get to the sort of a broader story of Abraham, Lot, Sedom.
Can I ask a question before?
Yes, please.
Why is it okay that so Hashem says, why did Sarah laugh, but doesn't ask why Yitzchak laughed?
Well, Yitzchak didn't laugh. You mean Abraham?
I mean, yes, I mean Abraham.
Last week Abraham laughed, and there was no. There, God doesn't criticize him for laughing.
Right.
And here Sarah laughs, and Sarah is criticized for laughing. And especially you can say that Sarah's laughing is not less offensive because Sarah laughed when a person told her something, and there's no reason for her to assume that this is an angel of God, right? And Abraham laughs when God tells it to him. So how does he laugh? So I don't have a good answer. I'll tell you two answers just to get in and out. I'll tell you two answers, and I'll tell you who said them. So if you don't like it, don't blame me, blame them. Okay. So the first answer is from the Targum. Targum Onkelos is, if you have my Bible here, this is most traditional Bibles. You have the Hebrew, and then you have Rashi. Next to the Hebrew, you have the Aramaic translation of the Torah, one of the earliest translations of the Torah, and it's called Targum Onkelos. It's a translation into Aramaic, and it's very early. It's at least 2,000 years old. So a lot of the later classic commentators in the Middle Ages, they're 1,000 years after the Targum. So he goes back a long time, and he translates the Hebrew word for tzachok, laughter, is in Hebrew. There are far fewer words than in English. I think English has, depends how you count. It could be 500,000 or million. It depends if you count variations. It's many more words than Hebrew. Hebrew has something like 50,000 words. Okay, so in Hebrew, there are many fewer words, but certainly biblical Hebrew. I'm not talking about modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew, you just take the American word and make it Hebrew. But biblical Hebrew word is a distinct word. So there are fewer words, and words mean different things. And the Targum says, when it comes to Abraham laughing, the Targum translates it as vachadi, and he rejoiced. And when it comes to this week's parsha, when Sarah laughs, the Targum translates it not as vachadi, rejoice, but as, let me see exactly the Aramaic, because my Aramaic is getting rusty. Chaychat means she smiled or she laughed. So basically, the short answer is that Targum would say it's not the same laughter. When I laugh, someone laughs. Laugh could mean a happiness, and laughter could mean disbelief. That's Targum's answer. Another answer is that Abraham heard it the first time. The first time you hear something and you laugh is understandable, but this is the second time. That's already not understandable. She should have known it, so it's not a surprise. Okay, that's a specific issue. I don't have a good answer for it. So I gave you two answers. There are probably more. I want to go to the big picture here. The big picture here is, I just read the story as two different scenes. Scene one, Abraham is inviting, God is with Abraham. God came to visit Abraham. He's sitting at the gate of the tent, and he's sitting at the gate of the tent, at the opening of the tent. Everyone knows the Medrash that their tent had four entrances, so a guest can come in from any direction. But in any case, that's scene one. Scene two is Sedom. What is Sedom? So you may know, we talked about this last week a little bit. Sedom is a city that it says there was terrible corruption. What was the big corruption? So the Medrash says that they outlawed charity. This was in a region where everybody is very wealthy, because the land is fertile and there's wealth. And they don't want a scenario. They're trying to create a utopia. Utopia is everyone has what they need. Nobody is dependent on anybody else. Now, it's a wonderful place to live. It's a wonderful way to live. In fact, that's where we're going to live in the Messianic era. There'll be nothing lacking. And mystically speaking, Sedom is very much connected to the Messianic era, because the Mashiach, the Messiah, comes from the house of David. We didn't mention it here, but David comes from Ruth, who's a convert from Moab, who is Lot's daughter, who was saved from Sedom. So the Jewish belief is that the monarchy of the Jewish people, and ultimately the Messiah who's going to bring peace to the entire world, comes from Sedom, which is a wicked city, which is a very strange concept, which we can talk about. We don't have that much time, but this is a fascinating concept. And the idea here is that usually, so the concept of Sedom, the concept was a beautiful concept, just premature. Utopia, everyone has what they need. There's nothing is lacking. That's the society we want to create. How do you create that society in this world? This world is a place of imperfection. There are people who suffer. So the answer is, let's make a gated community. Let's keep out all the people who are suffering. And how do you do that? You outlaw charity. Somebody comes in and asks for money, they literally would kill you if you gave charity. And that's the region of Sedom, very wealthy, very self-sufficient, and also their ideology was against charity. And we'll, if I have a minute or two, we'll talk about that. Maybe we'll go 5 minutes late. We'll go to 11:05. So I don't have to swallow my own words. So their ideology is no charity. And in Torah's perspective, that's the terrible and wicked and the antithesis of Abraham, which Abraham is all about kindness. Now, these two scenes, say the Medrash, these two scenes are two mirrors of the two sides of the same coin. The Torah says later in this week's parsha, God says, am I not going to tell Abraham that which I'm going to do to Sedom? I know him, I love him, because he teaches his family to do charity and justice. In other words, God loves Abraham because Abraham does justice, charity and justice. We'll talk about that in a minute. When it comes to Sedom is the opposite. So in other words, in some sense, Abraham's example explains why God is destroying Sedom. They could have learned from Abraham. They didn't. Abraham is the epitome of kindness. Just a few miles away from Abraham, you have a culture which is the exact opposite of Abraham's kindness, and therefore has to be destroyed. Now, according to the Medrash, this entire thing is basically a court case. It's basically a trial. Those two same guests that start off with Abraham, they go to Sedom. And whether or not, in this nutshell, it says they went to the doomed city of Sedom. Well, I think that's I get offended by that word. It's clearly not doomed. According to the sages, this was the trial. If what happens is Lot invites the people, those two guests, to his home, and the entire city gather around Lot's house as a mob, and they want to destroy this, and they want to kill these people. That's the moment. That's the first time the people say, "Let's get out of here. We're destroying the city." Up to that point, Lot invited them into their house. He fed them dinner. They went to sleep, or they almost went to sleep. It was bedtime. And then the people heard that there's guests, and they came and the mob surrounded the house. And only when the mob surrounded the house, did the people said, Lot, okay, find your daughters, let's get out of town. Which means that if the mob would not surround the house, and if they did not want to, and they would not want to kill the guests or harm the guests, the city would be spared. In other words, and then why was Lot saved? You could say Lot was saved because the Torah says because he's Abraham's nephew. Yeah, but Lot was only saved after he risked his life inviting the guests. In other words, he demonstrated, not that he's Abraham's biological nephew, but he also demonstrated that he's Abraham's spiritual nephew, because even though he moved away from Abraham, the idea of guests, when he saw a guest, he had no choice but to invite him. He felt too guilty, so he invited the guest. So this entire story is a story about kindness and its antithesis. Now, one more word about Sedom. I have 4 minutes left. One more word about Sedom. According to the commentators, I think this is actually very profound. How do you get to a society which outlaws charity? And every ideology starts with something positive, and then sometimes when you take it to the extreme, it becomes corrupt. So if you want to go back to the history of people and the story, you have the flood, and the flood comes because the world was full of Hamas. Hamas, that's the Torah's word, Hamas. And Hamas is, in Hebrew, it's corruption, but mostly robbery. And the commentaries explain that there was no regard for people's property. If you came to sell grapes in the market, everybody would come. Every person would come, take one grape. I'm just taking one grape. And before you know it, you have no merchandise. And basically, there was no respect for private property. And that led to the corruption of the generation of the flood. You can't have a society if people are stealing from each other all the time. Okay. So that led to the world's corruption. Now, so the commentaries explain, now you get to the point where what is the result of that? So now think about the next generation, when they realize that was a problem. So they want to correct that. So how do you correct that? The way you correct that, we say, let's sanctify private property. Because we saw what happened when we had disregard to private property, the world came to corruption. So let's institutionalize private property. But they take it to the extreme. Private property to the extreme is what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. And private property is sacred to the extent where don't give anybody else what is yours. That's offensive. It's mine. I worked for it. Why would I give it to you? You're undeserving. And they were afraid if I say give of your resources to somebody else, they're going to say that's a slippery slope. The next thing that's going to happen is people are going to come and take it themselves. So they want, as a response to the corruption of the world and the generation of the flood, the response is private property is sacred. Okay. Now they got the other end of the corruption. What does the Torah say about Abraham? A very interesting phrase in this week's Parsha. Why God loves Abraham? Because Abraham does tzedakah umishpat, charity and judgment. What does that mean, charity and judgment? There are all kinds of interpretations. Some people translate it differently. Tzedakah could be righteousness and judgment, or charity and judgment. Tzedakah is charity. So following this interpretation, I have 60 seconds left, is as follows. Judgment means private property. The whole idea of judgment, I take you to court because you stole my tomato. Judgment is the place where you enforce private property. Ownership is judgment. If there's no ownership, there's no judgment, right? So ownership is judgment. So judgment is private property. Tzedakah is charity. In other words, the Jewish way is we believe in private property, and yet we're going to give charity. And both are important. Because if we don't believe in private property, then there's no such thing as charity. Because charity means I'm giving the other of what is mine. So then you have certain collective systems, communism, socialism, and they say it's not yours. It belongs to the collective, belongs to the state. And we're going to create a utopia. It's wonderful. But if you do that, there's no kindness. There's no kindness. If I'm giving to you because I don't own it, it's no kindness. What is kindness? Kindness is it's mine, it's rightfully yours, and you transcend yourself and you give to somebody else. So to do that, you have to have both concepts. You have to have a strong belief in private property and it's a strong value of transcending the self and caring for others. That's tzedakah mishpat. That's the phrase, charity and justice. The generation of the flood, they had neither. There's no charity, no justice. They would just steal. People of Sedom say, we need to make private property and ownership sacred. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go to a wealthy region where everybody has enough fertile land to grow whatever they want and everyone could accumulate wealth. But the way to maintain that philosophy is we don't believe in sharing. And that's the other side of the corruption. And the Jewish way is no, you have to have private property, first of all, because God believes in ownership, the Torah believes in ownership. But in some sense, without ownership, there's no kindness, there's no charity. Because it's only kind if it's yours and you choose to give it away. And that's Abraham. So in other words, one way to read the whole entire part of the story is it's not isolated. The story of Lot and Sedom starts with the story of Abraham greeting the guests, because those are the contrasts and those are the extremes. And that's the value that the Torah is conveying, that there is mishpat, there is judgment, there is law, there is mine, and there is yours. Those borders are correct. But the purpose of life is to be able to be kind, to transcend the self, just like God gives, we give to others. And I just want to conclude, even though I'm a minute late, the opening scene was God came to visit the sick. And visit the sick is kindness. And Abraham's awareness of God is that God is kind. So therefore, he is the same to others, right? So we make a full circle. But the bottom line is that the first two stories is not two isolated stories. They're two sides of the same coin. They're the reason why Lot is saved. The reason why Sedom is destroyed is all their relationship with the concept of kindness. And Abraham is the one that epitomizes the kindness, tzedakah mishpat, not only for himself, but for his children and his family and his society. As the Torah says, this week's Parsha, I love him, I know him, or I love him, depending on how you read the verse, because he commands his children and his household to do charity and justice. In other words, it's not just he, but it's also his education, educating his family and educating his surrounding society to represent the values of tzedakah mishpat, judgment, but kindness. And remember, there's no kindness without judgment. There's no kindness without judgment. There could be no kindness without ownership. So that's a little bit on the parsha, a lot more to say. So hopefully we'll come back next year in good health and we'll continue the journey. In the meantime, next week, we're going to continue the story of Abraham in good health, hopefully, God willing. Everyone should have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbat. Thank you all for joining.
Shabbos, thank you, Ishko.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Wonderful day.